Okay, so we're now recording. I'm also going to okay, that looks good. Okay, well, thank you for completing the poll. It looks like we have about 85% of the folks in the room are students. So welcome NIU students and community members and anyone else who is joining us today. Good to have you with us. We have about 30 folks that have signed in, it looks like. And I do expect a couple more. I'm going to have the chat up. So if you want to put any questions, put those in the chat. And then I will make sure to answer them kind of at the end. So let's get started. So you're here today. The program is called Community Radical Settlement Houses in Chicago. And specifically, I'm going to focus in on one of the settlement houses that I have been studying for a little while. So my name is Dr. Alicia Schatteman. I'm the director here of the Center for Nonprofit and NGO Studies at NIU. And this is kind of our quick overview. So I'll go over a couple things about the center, in particular, the Oxford Study Abroad program that I'm a part of this summer. And this is part of a course that I hope to teach on settlement houses. Then we'll give an overview of the settlement house movement in Chicago a little bit, move into the organization that I've been studying. And then as we have time, we'll do Q&A. So the center is located in Zulauf Hall 114. We're between the visitor parking lot, Stevens Hall, Cole, and then a little bit near DeSable. So if you're over in that neck of the woods, stop in. 114 on the first floor. We have an undergraduate major, minor, and certificate in nonprofit and NGO studies, and a new undergraduate certificate in grant writing. We host between 20 and 30 nonprofit internships annually. Many of those are paid. You do not have to be a major to do a nonprofit internship, so reach out to us if we can help with that. We do a number of different service projects on campus and off campus. We also have a community engagement floor in Grant Hall. So if you're a student and live in the dorms or will be living in the dorms next year, you might want to check that out. I do a podcast called All Things Local. And if you're interested in kind of what's going on in the community, I talk to a bunch of government and nonprofit folks about their jobs and how they support communities. We do a monthly e-newsletter. So if you signed up for this program, you'll now receive that in your email once a month, usually the first week of each month. And then we do a number of networking events that are professional development for our students, where we invite nonprofits to participate, former alums. So if you're interested in that, the spring one will be virtual and the fall will be in person. So you'll get more information about that as in our newsletter. This undergraduate certificate in grant writing, we kicked it off last fall. 4 courses, they are all open to any major. English 350 is offered every semester. Our philanthropy and fundraising class is offered every spring, taught by our instructor, Anna Mary Walker. Nonprofit program development and evaluation, we plan to offer that this summer online. And I taught our new grant proposal seminar last fall, and it'll be taught every fall. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to your academic advisor. Our advisor here for the NNGO program, as well as the college, is Stephanie Kummerer, and you can find her information on our website. If you're not familiar, the center also operates the Husky Closet here on campus. It's located in the field house. That's on the corner of Lucinda and Annie Glidden. The hours are Wednesday 11:30 to 1 and Thursday 4:30 to 6:30, free and open to any NIU student. We have a number of different clothing items, coats, shoes, dress clothes, casual clothes, etc. So if you know of anyone who could stretch their budget a little bit and spend money elsewhere, invite them to come to the closet. You can also volunteer for the closet, so you can check that out at goniu.edu/Husky Closet. So this course, the piece that I'm going to talk about today is what gave me kind of the inspiration to put together a course for the Oxford Study Abroad program. That's going to take place June 25th to July 29th. So that's 5 weeks in Oxford. The application deadline is March 1st. It requires a $100 deposit to get in by March 1st. So if you're considering it, if you have a deposit in by March 1st, that'll help us determine interest. And then you have some time again to do the full payment. There is some financial aid available for study abroad. So if you're interested at all, you can reach out to me about this course or the study abroad office in particular, and their website is right there. So this that I'm going to be chatting with you today is part of a course that I suggested around the settlement house movement that really started in London and then expanded to the world. And so the 5-week course will allow us to go into more detail about the role of religion, education, gender, race, sexual identity in the settlement house movement, policy advocacy by social reformers, the role of settlement houses in legal innovation and experimentation, how they were financially supported and how that funding shifted over time, and then some controversy about the work of progressive reformers. And we'll investigate our notions of charity, volunteerism, and assimilation. So it's a big meaty course, so I'm just going to touch on some things today. The other 2 courses are one Shakespeare course by Dr. Ryan Hibbett from English, and the other course is on the Beatles, a study in politics and popular music with Dr. Art Ward from political science. You could also do independent studies with any of the 3 faculty who are going. So if you are an undergrad or a graduate student and interested in the Oxford trip, you can get more information on the website, reach out to me. Dr. Ward is actually the program coordinator. So if you have questions about the program overall, you can also find Dr. Ward in political science. So my personal background is I worked in nonprofits for 10 years before I went back to get my PhD. And my degree is in public administration, but I've always kind of focused my energies and teaching and research in the nonprofit space. So I'm affiliated faculty member in the center, and then my tenure home is public administration. So I teach nonprofit management, strategic planning, nonprofit finance, all the stuff that I like. And this kind of caught my eye, this headline. So on January 21st, 2012, it was announced that Hull House was closing. And it was the first settlement house in Chicago, one of the very early settlement houses in the country. And it caught my eye for several reasons. I had just started learning about Jane Addams and her work as a social reformer. And it was surprising, I think, and a shock to some that Hull House had in fact, succumbed to years of problems, but did end up closing in the end. Because if we think of Jane Addams, a larger than life kind of personality, lots of people would recognize her face even, but certainly her work in the late 1800s and into the 20th century. So really fascinating woman. She certainly has, as part of many programs of study in social work, sociology, etc. So then I started to think and did a little bit of digging of, well, how many settlement houses existed in Chicago and how many are still left given that Hull House had closed. So did a quick search, always start out with Wikipedia and then go from there. So according to Wikipedia, there was about 43 at the peak and about still 8 that are operating today. And Chicago Commons is one of the 8. And they have morphed and changed for sure over time. And certainly when I talk about Chicago Commons, you'll see that. And Chicago Commons is an interesting one because they were coming up on their 125th anniversary, and they were doing some look back at their history. So that also kind of caught my eye. So it all started back in 1884 in the UK, and it really was Oxford and Cambridge universities that saw the need in lower income communities in London that kind of sparked that settlement movement. Samuel Bennett was an Anglican cleric and canon of Westminster Abbey, and along with his wife, Henrietta Barnett, they were considered social reformers of the time. So Samuel was invited to visit Oxford by Gertrude Townby, so that's why it was named Townby Hall, in 1884. And Arnold Townby was her husband, and he was an Oxford historian who had just died. So Samuel was named head resident of Townby Hall, and then the settlement houses were created again around that time to address that increasing poverty in Victorian England. So they were meant to create communities where people from across the socioeconomic landscape could live together and work together to address these societal causes for poverty in particular, especially with rising industrialization happening in London and elsewhere. So going back a little bit to Jane Addams, she was born and educated here in Illinois. She actually visited Townby Hall in 1887 with Ellen Gates Starr. So 1884, so 3 years later, her and Ellen visit Townby Hall and see what's happening there. So they come back to Chicago and found Chicago's Hull House in 1889. So when we're at Oxford for the study abroad, we're going to visit Townby Hall, which is still there, and talk about what made that kind of a place where this movement started. So the international settlement house movement really peaked in the 1920s, and some then evolved into kind of what I would say is more modern nonprofit social service agencies that we have today. So the first settlement house in the US was the University Settlement in New York City, founded in 1886. And it was the first one in the United States and only the second in the world after Townby Hall. And then a lot of other places started, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, et cetera, especially as these were major ports for immigration. So in 1910, there was about 400 settlements and cities across the country. And it really was that same thing that was going on in London, really industrialization, increasing poverty in the urban areas. And settlement houses were meant to counter those things by providing neighborhood-based solutions that could meet very specific needs, much like community centers idea. So this new type of social service agency focused on kind of the root causes of poverty. They were engaged in research, for example, advocacy. So they helped to inform a juvenile court system. They were talking about pension programs, promoting legislation, trying to prohibit child labor and other public health concerns at the time as a result of the industrialization movement. So Hull House in Chicago then is 1889. And if you really, you can go visit, it's now a museum. So if you're by UIC at all, you can go check out the museum that's there. So they really started to become more common in major cities across the country in the late 19th century. Again, we had large immigration waves and technology advances as people moved into cities. So Hull Settlement House was founded by Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr. They were pioneers in Chicago in particular because they were trying to meet the residents, their poverty as well as lack of education, folks coming into the country to meet literacy skills, childcare, healthcare, all kinds of things, and really flourished during that early 20th century. They were, so as I said, they were over 40 that existed at its height, and now we're down to 8. So what are some of the methods for the students in the room when you're doing a research project? When I wanted to dig into this, where do I go? So if you're a history background, I am not a trained historian, but I have become a closet, an amateur historian. I aspire to be a historian. And so I dug into archival research at Highland Park Library, and you'll see why Highland Park in particular kind of later on. I visited Chicago History Museum and looked at their archives, the Newberry Library, University of Illinois at Chicago, IIT, and so far the Wisconsin Historical Society archives. So those are places that I've visited so far to see what they have in their collections and what kind of archival documents that I could look at. So a ton of things that could be read. The good thing is that there was a lot left behind from the Chicago Commons founding, from its founder, and also some of the documents that were produced from the family as well as the organization. So it just includes a vast collection, correspondence, scrapbooks, clippings, photographs, diaries. And I'll tell you why some of those things kind of ended up in the archives. There's also a few collections outside of Chicago, Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, where Miss Taylor graduated from, and University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana. So this was really, that's where my research kind of started, was in these archives. And the goal was to read through what exists and then figure out, almost in a grounded theory approach, what am I looking at, what am I researching to, and then try to theorize why that it happened the way it did. And I was really curious about, why the Chicago Commons, how it evolved into the institution that we see today, and then in particular when Leah was running the organization. So why Leah? So Leah, she actually did an oral history at the age of 95, and it's completely transcribed, and there's an audio recording. And I have both. So I could hear in her own words talk about her life and what she thinks she was able to accomplish, the things that she worked on during her tenure at Chicago Commons, etc. So really, really amazing opportunity to study her, given the rich materials that we have. She also left a mark on newspaper records, and she shows up several times in the newspapers in Chicago because of her service or her awards that she had won, her engagement in community affairs. So lots of newspaper records when it comes to her. She also shows up in the Chicago Commons, shows up in several journals as well as books written about the settlement houses, and in particular, Graham Taylor. So I'm still collecting some of that information background, but there's a lot of material there. So who were the Taylors that were behind the Chicago Commons Settlement House? So this is Graham and Leah, and you'll notice that Leah, the mother, spells her name with an H. So this is Leah Taylor's parents. Leah is the woman that I'm interested in. But Graham really founded Chicago Commons. So he actually takes all the credit for that first generation. So a peer to Jane Addams. They were operating at the same time. So they would have been peers. So Graham and Leah come from the New York, New Jersey area. They come from a long line of ministers, and he actually was a professor at the Chicago Theological Seminary, which is what brought him to the Midwest and Chicago specifically. So he moved his family here. Leah, his wife, also came from the New Jersey area, also lots of family connections to the Dutch Reform community and faith. Her brother, William, became the president of Rutgers College, which is now Rutgers University. So very learned, academic, and definitely a faith background. So this is a little bit of their family tree. You'll see Graham and Leah here, and you'll see lots of reverends on both sides, lots of prominent Dutch names from the New Jersey and New York area. So Leah and Graham here at the top, they had 4 children, and you'll see here that Leah is the 3rd eldest, and who I'll spend most time chatting about today, but I'll mention her brother and her sisters as well. So the family moves from the New Jersey area to Hartford, Connecticut when Graham becomes pastor of the 4th Congregational Church in Hartford. So they lived at a couple of locations there, and that's actually where Leah is born, the 3rd child of Graham and Leah. And then Sister Helen is born, or Sister Catherine is born after her. So they lived there until 1894 when Graham moves the family to Chicago. So I was particularly interested in Leah because, so she was born in 1883 and passes away in 1975. She played a significant role in the growth and sustainability of Chicago Commons Settlement House, and she served as head resident and what we would call today maybe executive director from 1921 to 1954. And that's a significant amount of time, plus it's significant, and if you can imagine what was going on nationally and globally during those years. She was heavily engaged in the Commons before 1921, but then she operates it as the head resident for those 30 years. And even after stays engaged, and I'll tell you more about that. So this is Leah here sitting in one of the rooms at Chicago Commons, and that's her father, his picture's up there on top of the mantle. So why the Commons? And Graham answered this question directly when he was asked this question, why did you call it the Commons? And one answer he'll offer is that we should choose our friends not only on the vertical instead of just on the horizontal. So basically, we need to get away from people who just think the same thing the same way, and we should get to know people who think differently, so that because we can learn a great deal from them. So he said we called the Commons because we hope that it might be a common center where friendship, neighborship, and fellow citizenship might form the personal bonds of that social unification for which alone can save our American democracy from disruption. And so this was in 1897. You can see that there is not a lot of places in the world today that brings people together of all different backgrounds and all different economic situations, all different education, all different ages, all different races, all different, etc. So the call that if we could meet together in a common space, we could actually support democracy is something that's long lasting. So around the same time, 1893, we have the World's Fair in Chicago, one of the most significant events. It was, celebrating that 400 years of Christopher Columbus coming to the United States in 1492. So significant growth in Chicago, lots of attention on Chicago at this time, lots of building, lots of people coming to Chicago and seeing what's happening. And at the same time, you have lots of challenges with the rising population and in particular poverty. So in 1894 is when Graham moves his family to 140 North Union Street. And this was their first settlement house shown here. So Graham comes first and moves into the rental with a couple of individuals from the seminary where he's teaching. And then Graham brings his family out from Connecticut shortly thereafter. And they were one of the only families at the time living in the settlement house. So most of the settlement house, all the other settlement houses were for adults. And so Leah and her brothers and sisters were the first children to live in the settlement houses. And that, that was controversial at the time. Jane Addams in particular is said to have not been pleased by that, that she didn't feel that it was the place for young children necessarily to be in that role as part of the settlement house community, even though they were serving lots of kids. So Hull House opens again 1889, and then 1894, this first Chicago Commons starts. So the Taylor family moves in, and at this point, Leah is just 11 years old. So again, she has one younger sister and two older siblings, a brother and a sister. So the kids are fairly young and moving into this home. In 1899, they purchased land at Grand and Morgan Streets in Chicago. And then they were going to build, because this was a temporary home. So they moved in June of 1895 into this new home. So Leah goes to the Lewis Institute and for high school. She graduates from Lewis Institute in 1900. The Lewis Institute was a school for liberal arts, engineering, and science. It operated independently until about 1940, and then it actually merged with the Armour Institute and became the Illinois Institute of Technology, and no longer a high school. It became into a higher ed institution, but that's where she attended high school. So in 1901, they move into 180 Grand Avenue. And this was their second location. It was where the old Tabernacle Congregational Church was. So the Chicago City Missionary Society gave them the land for $1. The church was torn down, and then the settlement house was put up. It was designed by an architectural firm. And one of those individuals who worked for the architectural firm, he actually ended up dating Helen, one of the Taylor sisters, and they got married later. So they met because he was staying at the Chicago Commons while they were designing this house. So the family then, Helen and her husband, once they were married, they actually moved to Ravinia, which is a neighborhood of Highland Park. And that's where the Highland Park starts, because that's where she lived the rest of her life. So the Chicago Commons, they ended up staying there through the mid-1950s, when the construction of the Kennedy Expressway displaced a lot of homes, but in particular the Chicago Commons on Grand Avenue. So Leah, after she graduates from high school, she goes to Vassar. Her sister, at this point, she was working as her father's secretary, her sister Helen. So once Leah graduates from Vassar, she comes back and she takes on those secretarial duties that her sister had done. Her sister's now married, and she continues working for her father. When she was at Vassar, she had to kind of earn her own way. She applied for different scholarships. She ended up living with family friends the first couple of years. She worked as a tutor. Her mother made her clothes and sent them to her. There's lots of interesting correspondence between her mother and Leah while she's at Vassar, and all of those documents are also, interestingly, at the archives. So she comes back to Chicago as soon as she graduates from Vassar. And Chicago in the early 1900s, there's lots of things going on, lots of problems, as any large city is experiencing huge growth in population. So there's lots of public health concerns, which is the settlement movement was really instrumental in trying to address some of those. They were doing public health outreach, they were doing literacy, childcare, all of that when Leah returns to Chicago. So she quickly becomes part of many things that are going on. She becomes chair of the wider use of the schools committee. And I was just speaking with someone about this, that this is around 1909. She's getting involved in the Chicago Recreation Commission. And that's where people are pushing to have the public schools open for recreation outside of school hours, because there's not enough recreational facilities in the city. So they commission a study, and that's the book that you see on the right here, and that's really to talk about that issue of lack of recreation in the city, and they want to address that. So when they see a problem, a lot of their responses were, let's do some research and then let's start to advocate for change. So in 1910, there was a significant garment strike workers, which really affected women because they were predominantly women who were working in those industries. They took to the picket line, and Leah had not necessarily part of the protest, but certainly part of the trying to support those women as they were striking and around those labor conditions. So doing a lot of advocacy. In 1911, the National Federation of Settlements was founded by Jane Addams. And the Federation was to work on these larger social problems through local development and community involvement. Leah does become president of that national foundation at two different times, in the 30s and again in the 50s. And then she worked on several different research projects, one on the young working girls in 1913, and then around employment in 1931. So it's a very common response that we see from these settlement houses, where they're seeing problems at the local level and they're trying to have them addressed in different pieces of legislation, either at the local, state, or even sometimes the federal level. So at the same time as she's involved in these larger issues in Chicago and the state or the country, she's also running the Chicago Commons organization. So they're publishing annual reports, and I teach nonprofit management, undergrad and graduate, and nonprofits are still doing this. So she was doing this in the early 1900s. I was always curious about their financial models. So Graham, her father, never took a salary, which is very typical of founders of nonprofit organizations. He really relied on his salary from the seminary. So his full-time job in the seminary, teaching, and then but they did have some paid staff even at this point. So in her oral history, she talks about that the board members did contribute in their own way, but didn't do a lot of fundraising. Her father really had primary fundraising responsibilities as the head resident, and then later when he stayed on the board. They had certain endowments at the time, like this one from J.P. Dodge. This was an old money family that moved from Massachusetts to Chicago and founded some companies there. So we have to remember that these settlement houses are within the context of what was going on in the country, and women didn't still have the right to vote in 1913. And here's Leah running this, one of the settlement houses. She wasn't the only one. There were many women that were running these settlement houses. There's some really good books about this, why women were drawn to this work, and how really the profession of social work grew out of a lot of these early settlement house women and the settlement house work. So women's suffrage is still in play in the early 1900s. The housing stock in Chicago was pretty severe in certain neighborhoods, and families were struggling financially to make it, especially new immigrants coming into the city. And then World War I hits, 1914 to 1918. So in 1917, Chicago Commons operated the local draft board, and the settlement residents were called to interview prospective inductees, explain induction procedures to neighborhood residents. So they were really working to get recruits at the neighborhood level. They were working through the government to do that at the very local level. In their annual report in 1916, Leah notes that it really was an adventure of faith. it might not have survived except for people really investing their lives and their money in this public service. And I would say this is very common for, startup nonprofits to have this kind of leap of faith that things will work out. They really tried to build up their endowment funding, for example, and because we would like, endowments to really cover half of our annual budget. At that point, their annual budget was pretty small, but I think that's an admirable goal. Most organizations would love to have their annual income, half of it coming from endowments, which is often not the case unless unless your endowments go back several hundred years and they're constantly building those things. This is a picture from 1917. This is Graham off into the right-hand side here. Young men and women, in the common areas, probably taking classes or working on a different projects. This could have been during the draft board era. This is another picture of some childcare that was happening in the commons. So there was a place where you could bring your children so you could go to work. Men and women were part of the labor force, as many just to make ends meet, and so the children would have a safe place to stay while they were at work. So according again to Leah's oral history in 1917, that's when she was asked to take on that head resident with the magnificent salary of $1,500 a year. But then she had to assume responsibility for budgets and raising money and really working within the community to try to raise more awareness and the funding. So that was 1917. Her mother passes away in 1918. She had been sick a little while, but in 1918 she passes away, and that really hits her father hard, but also the rest of the family. They're a very tight-knit family. And again, Leah, her mother, is also living with the family at the settlement house. There was lots of fundraising going on, and Reverend Taylor was instrumental in getting many of these things. Sometimes he even loaned his own money, but he did reach to the more influential folks in Chicago when it comes to covering their annual operating expenses, certain loans or mortgages that had to be paid. He was also researching them as well. I bring up Victor Lawson because he was the publisher of the Chicago Daily News, president of the Associated Press, very significant involvement with the Chicago Commission on Race Relations. Frank McCullough was a leader as well. He was a lawyer in Chicago. His wife, Catherine McCullough, was also a lawyer, which was very uncommon for a woman at the time. She was an outspoken local and national spokesperson for women's rights. She actually graduated from Williams College and went on to Harvard Law School. She couldn't find a job because they wouldn't hire her as a woman. And so her and her husband, who was a fellow attorney, they started their own practice. They were significant to the Chicago Commons, especially in those early years, and really put their legal training and their financial resources behind the Chicago Commons. You might have heard that Chicago is one of the cities for the Great Migration from the 1910s to the 1950s. And that's really the long-term movement of African Americans from the South to the North. It transformed Chicago and other cities between that time period. It attracted slightly more than 500,000 of the approximately 7 million African Americans who left the Southern states during those decades. So before 1910, African Americans constituted about 2% of Chicago's population. By 1970, they were about 33%. So it continued, and Chicago, like the rest of the world, the cities where African Americans went, they were also faced with significant racial discrimination, both from employers who would not hire them, housing, etc. So the Chicago Commons kind of took those issues and took them on in the settlement house movements, and really tried to influence public policy to address some of the racism that was happening within the cities. So you can see this is a chart just looking at population growth in Chicago from 1850 to 1900. That's where you see the peak in 1950, and you'll see how it had grown from when Chicago Commons started, which was 1894, less than 1 million, and now you were up to over 3 million by 1950. In the annual report in 1919, again, I mentioned that they wanted nearly half of their budget coming from invested funds. So they were really building up those endowments to do that. with limited success. They had some, they never got to a point where half of their budget was coming from that, but that was certainly their goal. By 1920, the 19th Amendment giving women's right to vote, and it was, you know, after almost a century of protest. So it took a long time to get there, but that comes in while Leah is just embarking on beginning her head resident period. So in 1921, they had 9 full-time staff, 5 part-time workers working specifically in the Chicago Commons. And she is at this point moving from assistant head resident to full head resident. They were doing annual appeals, so same things that you hear today at the end of the year when you're reporting out. They put this little tear out sheet, please send in your dollars as a contribution to the Chicago Commons Association, and mail that in. She was trying to take over a lot of fundraising activities that her father had been a part of. So this is Graham, the second from the left. And this is a photograph, which I like looking at because it's this is in front of, I don't know if you can see, it's kind of faint, the Graham Taylor Hall. This is at the University of Chicago. And here he's standing with Julius Rosenwald. He's the gentleman all the way in the left. And then the mayor of Chicago, William Hale Thompson. He served as mayor of Chicago from 1915 to 1923. And then again, 1927 to 1931. And this is Leah here, the only female in the group. But these were significant political figures, significant philanthropists of the era. And Leah is part of that group, along with her father, to maintain those relationships. So who was Julius Rosenwald? He is best known for being the president of Sears Roebuck and Company. He used a lot of his philanthropic dollars to address inequality in the education of Jewish and African American populations. He's credited with donating more than $65 million to various causes. He had met Booker T. Washington and became a trustee of the Tuskegee Institute. And he also traveled with several Chicago leaders to the Tuskegee Institute, including Reverend Graham Taylor from Chicago Commons. And among many of his contributions to the University of Chicago were his early support of the Graduate School Social Service Administration that was started by Reverend Taylor. He also founded the Museum of Science and Industry. He did create a foundation in 1917 that was meant to be a spend down foundation, meaning the original gift would be spent down over time and not live in perpetuity like many other foundations like the Ford Foundation and others. So it was created in 1917 and was to be liquidated 25 years after his death, so it ended in 1948. And it spent about $63 million, most notably in support of African American education. So the other gentleman I mentioned was Victor Lawson, as the newspaper publisher of the Chicago Daily News. And he was a significant donor to Chicago Commons. This was a photograph of a telegram that came from him. Well, it came from Leah talking about him, and she sent it to her father saying, Victor Lawson leaves Chicago Commons $100,000 unconditionally. And that's equivalent to $1.4 million from 1925. Leah was a significant speaker, both in Illinois as well as across the country, and she visits Toronto in 1928 and gives a talk to the Toronto Social Work Conference. So a lot of her speeches were still maintained with her notes. She would write a speech, type the speech, and then she made all kinds of notes all over the place. Her writing's kind of messy, but you can make out most of it. So those are also available in the documents. Her father, who was, again, a pastor and a professor, he wrote reams and reams of things. Leah wrote much less than him. She would probably say she was not an academic. So she didn't write a lot, but what she did write, we do have copies of. I mentioned that in her oral history, she talks about how the family contributed. The family was not overly wealthy. Her family on both sides really dedicated their lives to public service. Either that was in higher education or in the churches. So they would help with some emergencies. Sometimes, getting a loan from a bank to make sure that we could make it through another month. So in 1929, she becomes head resident. You can also read more about her in a book, which is a pretty hefty reference book, Women Building Chicago, 1790 to 1990, and she's also in there. Judith Trolander, she wrote a book, Settlement Houses in the Great Depression. And she talks about Leah in that she was the sort of person who attended meetings of the unemployed while being listed in the Chicago Social Register. So her ability to work with people at all levels of society was remarkable. So if you remember early on when I mentioned that her father chose the Commons to talk about we should have friends along the horizontal and the vertical, and really Leah took that to heart. She had many acquaintances that would be considered more of the higher economic social status, but also chose to live her life in the commons, in the settlement houses, in the neighborhoods. By 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment is introduced, although we all know it was not fully ratified in the country, and it keeps coming around every once in a while. I think the last effort was in 2017. Illinois ratified in 2018. In 2020, Virginia passed a ratification. I don't know if it'll ever get through all the states because there's always legal challenges to it. So it was introduced in 1923, but we don't still have full ratification. 1924, this is a picture from the Chicago Historical Society. This is Reverend Taylor here giving a speech outside to the masses. He is doing a flagpole dedication at the Settlement Houses building on Grand Avenue. So today the building at 955 Grand Avenue is a private school called the Bennett Day School. A century ago, it was used as a settlement house. So you'll see pieces of it here and where you can see the addition. And then today it's a connected pair of 5-story buildings, and it connects to the original red brick and other buildings. 1929, the crash, the Great Depression, particularly severe in Chicago because of the city's reliance on manufacturing. That's the hardest hit sector nationally. Over 50% of Chicagoans work in manufacturing sector in 1927, and we don't have I don't have the data to tell you what that unemployment looked like, but it was severe, and African Americans and people of Mexican descent were particularly hurt. By 1932, 50% of Black workers in Chicago were unemployed. So it really affected everyone, and it affected certain ethnicities more than others. Lots of protests and marches during the 1920s and 1930s. The low-income residents of the Commons were hit hard by the Depression and the resulting unemployment. Leah took on a study of unemployment among the families that lived in the Commons and in the Commons area, and lobbied the federal government for relief funds. She sat on several Chicago committees, including the Works Progress Administration, which was the largest New Deal agency created by President Roosevelt. And they employed millions to carry out public works projects in order to overcome the recession that the country was in. By the 1930s, we have the Chicago World's Fair, 1933, and this is a book about the Chicago and the Great Depression. So if you're interested in that, you get more information there. In the 1930, she also receives an invitation to the White House to be a delegate for the Conference of Child Health and Protection. As far as I know, she did attend. I don't have anything in the archives otherwise, but I believe that she attended. By 1931, the Commons is doing pretty well. The largest number of donors that they've had to date through the 1930s. These are some of the reports that Leah would show. So they had a net increase of 80 contributors, so 13% over the previous year. After Graham died, he did leave a $25,000 trust fund as an endowment. And so some of their dollars now were coming through the endowment as well as through direct contributions. And residents who lived in the settlement houses did pay to live there. So they were paying fees as well. So that they had a pretty diversified, revenue stream. Leah becomes the first woman to be appointed to the Metropolitan Housing and Planning Council. And then when federal funds were made public housing possible in the 1930s, she advocated for an open housing policy and resident support services. 1938, her father does pass away at 87. So he lived a good long life, several years after his wife. He actually remarried along the way. And even though the family was hit pretty hard, Leah was particularly close to her father because she basically followed in his footsteps. So this was a hard one for her. 2 years later, her sister dies at 63. So if you remember when I was talking about the Chicago Commons, the design, that architectural firm, George Carr was her husband. He was on that crew. So she died at their home in Highland Park, and they had 2 children. One of the few of the sisters, it was the only sister that had any children. The brother and Helen had children, but Leah and her sister Catherine did not. So World War II comes to the world, and Leah is heavily involved again in the neighborhoods, talking about focusing on recruitment and setting up draft boards and support for families, etc. They were doing drives for donations, collecting scrap metal, paper, etc. When the war breaks out. Just 2 short years later, her brother passes away, Graham Taylor Jr. He had been involved in the settlement houses, but in a different way. He had actually moved back to the New York area and was an editor as well as a social worker with the Commonwealth Fund. So he passes away in New York State. In the 1940s, the Commons, they started a credit union. In 1939, they were using WPA workers during the war, but that was coming to an end. They were still producing their financial reports. This is when they start to merge with some other settlement houses. So Emerson House in particular was one of them that they merged from a settlement house, which was just 8 blocks away. This was also a point where they really thought through kind of transition and leadership succession. And so William Bruckner became the executive director of Chicago Commons. So this was their first professional manager of the association rather than a settlement house worker. And Leah remained as head resident. So they had different responsibilities, but this is where we see the leadership transition begin. So the directors here were her father, 1884 to 1921. Leah takes over as head resident, but for those 30 years, but she stays on the board also until 1954. William, and then you'll see Frank, 2 Franks, Dan and Edgar, who is the current executive director. So Leah has been the only woman to lead the organization in those 125 plus years. In the 50s, she stepped down as head resident, but she's now president of the National Federation of Settlements. She travels to Europe, the Secretary of Education, to visit European settlements. Again, she had gone previously in her youth. In 1952, she participates in a series of institutes focused on settlement and social workhouse. She served as chairman of the Child Care Institute in Germany for that summer, and it was to train teachers and social workers. In 1952, she's part still of the fundraising arm. This era also shifted from local community chests, community funds, and then that's transitioning into United Ways in Chicago. So she was part of that also switch. So you'll see the Chicago Commons Association. Leah is still listed as head resident on that executive board. And then you'll see some familiar names also that we talked about earlier, the McCulloughs in particular. And you might notice Ryerson Carr is a name that also comes up because Helen married into the Carr family. We talked about Catherine before. That was the Frank McCullough's wife. There's several auxiliaries, and these are kind of fundraising arms of the Chicago Commons Settlement House. So they had one in Oak Park, and they also had one in Highland Park. And this is a group of women typically in these neighborhoods that were raising money for the Chicago Commons in Chicago. In 1954, it's their 60th anniversary. She's now she's receiving several different awards, but she comes back and they raise some money for the 60th anniversary to honor her and her contributions to Chicago Commons. When she retires from being head resident in 1954, she does build a home in Highland Park, and it was up for sale last year or the year before, and really nothing had changed. I didn't go inside, but from the photographs, really nothing had gone inside. But it was a beautiful home in that this is the original location where her father and mother had lived, as well as her sister had lived. It's kind of a dead end street here off of Wade Street, if you're familiar at all with Highland Park. And she had this little home. The ravine actually goes up here on the right hand side behind these homes. It's very park-like. 1958, they've merged with a couple of settlement houses. So Emerson House that you'll see, the original settlement house, and they had a camp for a little while in New Buffalo, Michigan, and then they were also operating a youth center. I did get to talk to Pam Bruckner. So if you remember, William Bruckner took over from Leah in the 1950s. So this is his daughter. And she said that she was like her surrogate grandmother. She hired William Bruckner to run the commons after her. They would spend time at her house in Ravinia Station in Highland Park. She even helped with her college expenses. So public service, she has a long laundry list of things that she worked on while she was very active in the Chicago Commons. She was also active in the city as well as other places. So these are just a sample of some of her public service. There's a long list from recreation to housing, to employment, discrimination, YWCA. She was actively engaged in Highland Park as well when she moved there. So she was the founder of the Highland Park Committee on Human Relations, and was part of the Highland Park League of Women Voters. At the age of 77, in 1960, she travels to Europe for a reunion of the Unitarian Service Committee. She was part of that and then went back and did the reunion. In 1961, she's 78 and she is still fundraising. So she is sending out letters on her letterhead from the Commons to continue to foster that. So I guess fundraising never ended for her at the age of 78. She is still saying, please support the Chicago Commons. In 1973, she does relocate, starts to slow down, I guess. She relocates from Chicago to the Meadows. It's a retirement community in New Jersey. And she has a niece that lives on the East Coast still. So she lives in the retirement home for just those couple of years and passes away in 1975 at the age of 92. So when I was out in New Jersey last summer, I got to see the family burial plot in Elmwood Park in North Brunswick. So the family here has the main headstone here is Taylor, Graham, and Leah, and then their 4 children each have individual plots. So this is Leah's right here, June 1883 to December of 1975. In her will, she does identify some where she wanted her estate to be left. So it was dated November 1st, 1973, 2 years before she passes away. All of her personal belongings go to her niece, her brother's daughter, and that was I think that was it was her closest relative at that point. She lived nearby in New York, and all of the rest of the estate was left to a trust with Haythorne McCullough, the son of the McCulloughs who were on her board, and the Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company. That was the bank that failed in 1984 and was seized by FDIC and sold to the Bank of America, what became Bank of America. So I'm not sure what became of her trust. My guess is that it no longer existed, and there was not any money left after that. So Helen, her sister, as I mentioned, she passed away in her 60s or so. She met her future husband, George, when he was a boarder at the Commons, working with the firm Pond & Pond to design the new Chicago Commons. This was their home also on Wade Street. And she had 2 children, Janet and Wallace. Helen passed away herself in the 1940s. Janet married and died in 1956. Their son Wallace served in World War II, became a pilot with United Airlines, and died in 1966. Graham Jr., he married Florence Taylor, and they had 2 children, Graham III and Jean. He was an editor, civic leader, 20 years with the Commonwealth Fund. Graham went to Harvard and married Eleanor Townsend, served in World War II. They had 5 children, and he just actually passed away in 2020. Jean was a sculptor, graduated from Radcliffe. She married Carl Kroeber, who was and became an English professor, and she also passed away last year. Catherine was the youngest child. She went to Vassar like her older sister. She became an educator. She taught at the Francis Parker School in Chicago, and then she was asked to be principal of the new Shady Hill School in Cambridge, Massachusetts, an independent school. She did not marry, and she passed away in 1979. So Chicago Commons is still around. You can go check them out, chicagocommons.org. For over 125 years, this is their mission: empowered individuals, families, and communities to thrive across generations. So after all this, I still have questions, right? what would be research without more questions? How much did religion play a role during Leah's tenure in Chicago Commons? I don't know the answer to that yet. There was a great deal of leadership transition at Chicago Commons, but how was that managed? As settlement houses evolved into traditional social service agencies, what was lost and what was gained? At that, I'm going to put up the student check-in. If you are here for honors or business passport, you can scan those QR codes. And if anyone has questions, you can put them into the chat and I can answer any of those. And then I can also talk about kind of upcoming programs, because I know we just have a couple of minutes left. So any questions from anyone that I can answer, you can pop that into the chat. Or I'll try to answer. Students, did you get the QR codes? Because I want to talk about some upcoming programs in case people start to drop off, because I know we're getting close to 1. If you don't get it, I can also pop it into the chat later, these QR codes. See. So thinking about other things that we do here in the center, we have a program that's coming up about whether and how to form a nonprofit organization in Chicago, in Illinois, sorry. I'm talking so much about Chicago today. That's free. You can see the link is on our website to register for that one. Another one that's coming up in February is the Power of Psychology, Research on Fundraising Strategies with Dr. Jen Shang. She earned the first degree in philanthropy, and she's now a philanthropic psychologist. And then one in March about nonprofit fraud awareness and prevention. So if you're interested in stories about nonprofit fraud, we're going to hear from Jeff Ball, who right now is with the U.S. Department of Justice. That's always where you can find me here in the center. You can email me anytime, and you'll be getting our monthly newsletter. So if you're interested in coming to any of our future programs, we would love to have you. Thank you so much. I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. Any questions from anyone that I can attempt to answer? I know it's 12:57. People got to run. Great. Thank you very much. I hope you can come again. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.